very much.
I was totally distracted in the crowd just then, quite relaxed listening to that, which is good. And I'm glad Phil outlined I'm definitely also the lighter entertainment, having met Karen afterwards and got into some really interesting discussions. So, who the hell actually am I? I joined PwC about July last year. I'm a visual designer by trade, have been all my life. And I joined to help set up a new capability actually within PwC. So we are essentially a whole group of strategists, designers, makers, so that means experience designers, architects, service designers, brand designers, every shape, manner and size. And obviously we're having a lot of fun recently just making all of our brand materials, so I had to use some of those whilst we're going through. And to give you a sense of what we're tackling, at the moment this is kind of a shorter list, but essentially we're working with a tech retailer on a new service that will connect them up with customers. We're doing a lot at the moment with a UK university about the future of the student experience, so that's everything from like open days to applications to help them through, to curriculum, to the actual architectural setup of the university. We're doing work with an arts and culture company about launching their physical accessibility initiative, so that involves, again, more architectural aspects as well as also a digital platform, and there's also virtual reality in there, naturally, buzzwords. And then we're also doing a service design play for 2035 that involves robotics and AI, which is, I can imagine anyone in here doing AI at the moment, and anything to do with robotics is trying to think into the future is almost impossible. So this is kind of the scope of everything that we're currently, as designers, involved in. And I gotta say, this is like, for me, like, welcome to the moral ambiguity, because we are constantly coming up against new technologies, new ways of working, new methods, new processes, diverse communities, diverse individuals, and, you know, it doesn't always come out with the clearest answer, and we're kind of using as much information at our disposal currently. So this is very much uncharted territory. There's a couple of souls ahead of us, and there's stuff I'm sure we'll learn from Karen in a second as well on this. But ultimately we are kind of very much in this uncharted waters. And from my point of view, this uncharted waters is having a fairly large effect on the UK economy. So I'm sure you guys saw the report from the Design Council around the design economy, and there's been a really good McKinsey paper recently. But this figure of 85.2 billion is actually equivalent in the UK to distribution, transport, food and so on. So the scale of that's designers, as in pure play designers, like most of you guys in the room I imagine, and then that's also design thinking as a methodology within an organisation. So the impact is vast for design. And I think we've always wanted to have, maybe it's just me speaking here, but a seat at the table. You know, we've always wanted to be able to contribute more. We've always wanted to be the creative problem solvers that we know that we can be. And sometimes I think that in certain scenarios, it's a little bit like, you know, beware of what you ask for. There's certain things where you find yourself in discussions where you don't necessarily have the frameworks or the methodologies to kind of like lean back on, you know, and you're in learning as you go. Sometimes, like myself, I listen to conversations whilst being on Wikipedia underneath the table, which is a true story. So we have essentially, I'm not going to go into this topic, but we have this unlicensed influence, right? So although we can, as designers, go out and design absolutely anything, so the list of stuff before is across so many different industries and formats and outputs, we are an unlicensed resource. So we're basically trying to make our way through the world with the best that we know. So I don't know if you guys know Mike Monteiro. He's an author. He does do quite a lot around design ethics, and I recommend you kind of looking him up. But you know, he said this, which is quite a scary comment, but essentially every cigarette ad is on us, every gun is on us, every ballot that a voter cannot understand is on us. The world is working exactly as designed. And you know, that kind of like hits at home. Now I know it's not all the individuals in the room, but it's more talking about it broadly, obviously, as design. And it's not new as a topic. You know, design and ethics and the employment of persuasive techniques has been around for ages. I mean, I don't know if you guys ever see that, the LA parking signs, which are so complex and confusing that everyone gets fined, essentially. There's that awful, I hate to use the phrase, but they call it poverty porn in the middle there, which is ridiculous. Skittles, sex explosion. There's just so many instances, So it's not a new topic, but it is something that we're becoming far more aware and cognizant of. So this may, as a topic, do you guys know Ron Norman at all? In the 80s he started to bring in a lot around psychology and design. There's definitely a few nods in the crowd, which is good. And some of these phrases like human-centered design, emotional design, persuasive techniques, they started to become a little bit more mainstream and a little bit more, we became more aware of them generally. But now, as in this year, and even in the past couple of years, as designers we've had to deal with a lot more. We're dealing with accelerated technological change. Every 2 seconds you look around, there's something else being invented that you need to understand. You need to understand how that interplays, how that overlays with something, how it integrates, all those things. There's increased importance of information. So as people become far more fragile in their identities and communities, they're suddenly looking to these information sources in a lot more focus. There's general speed of change. There's amplified distribution capabilities. So things before that used to be able to be distributed in relatively small groups or communities now can be amplified globally with a lot more efficacy than ever before. And then obviously there's cognitive overload. So as Phil was mentioning, the constant stream of stuff that you kind of get on a day-to-day basis. So these are kind of all of the facets that we now need to start to pay a bit more attention to. And R, as we were talking about before with Karen, is far more measurable as well. So this is something we can start to consider. Very, very briefly, so Voice UI is a fantastic example of kind of this uncharted territory that's starting to be defined. So I'm sure you guys have gone into this, but there's all the reasons in the world as to why Siri, Cortana and Alexa are all female voices. But the majority of the reasons all come back down to the fact that female voices are considered to be more accepted by cultures. They're more accepted because people consider female voices to be helpful, caring, supportive. They're also more accepted because generally female voices allow others to solve problems by themselves. So they don't see them as bosses, they see them as people that will help them facilitate actions. And it's quite interesting when you go into this, because obviously there's a genderless voice that's just been released by Q, which will be fascinating to see how far that goes. But up until now, everything's been female. And the penetration of this is huge. So when you look at Britain alone, 25% of Britons now own one of these smart home devices. With all of their children, families, in this constant kind of relationship. And then that's going to double by 2020. And then on the right is obviously 400 million plus devices have the Google Assistant. So we're starting to talk about this really interesting amplified distribution, and some of the decisions we're making is actually going out a lot further than we would ever imagine they would be. So we definitely need new ways of thinking and new ways of creating. We need new processes, new methodologies, everything. And I think as designers, we now need to be very, we say innovative, adaptable, responsive, proactive. You can kind of get a sense of where all of these words are going. We need to be empathetic and aware. But basically that sometimes does feel a little bit like we need to be superhuman. Come on, are we doing absolutely everything here as well? It's not possible. And I think we do beat ourselves up a little bit about it. Particularly because the world in general is moving into more of a state of uncertainty. It's more complex, it's more volatile, and you can tell I could not decide which gift to put in. So I was just all of them going. So I want to take a step backwards for a split second to kind of go through, from my point of view, some of the foundational things around design. So for me, there is a lot of complexity in design, but it's bare bones basics. Design is the manipulation of human behaviour. So we start to think about it, that's in the arrangement of colours, in types, in buttons, in just general padding, margins, styles, everything, materials and so on. We have that manipulation of human behaviour because we're looking to elicit a response, we're looking to elicit an emotion. So there's a range of emotions here which will always give us something. They'll give us a sense of belonging, they'll give us a sense of fear, they'll give people a sense of anticipation and so on. But ultimately that emotional response is going to drive them to an action. So this is kind of stripping it back, all the way back. But, you know, those actions around engagement, attention, like, you know, so on and so forth, that flow is kind of where some of the pitfalls start coming in for us. And it's not always as simple as going, hey, I'm a really ethical person, I'm really well-meaning, I don't want to, like, you know, go into dark patterns, and I don't want to create unethical design. It's not really that simple, really. And I should say before going into this, I definitely don't have the answers. So, I mean, there's someone I used to work with in the past when I was younger. I'm sure that there are multiple instances in my past where I've accidentally and unintentionally fallen into the trap. You know, and some of those traps for me, I kind of wanted to run through for you guys just to kind of keep your eyes peeled for. So the first is, sometimes you can concentrate as a designer so much around some of these words that you forget what you're doing. So, you know, you start to talk to clients and you're talking about engagement, and you're talking about fans, and you're talking about pages being sticky, and you're talking about obviously getting more likes and so on. And it's very easy to just talk to each other in a little bit of a bubble and start to get into this flow. So that for me is kind of one of those traps to just stand back a little bit from. The other is a lack of experience in education. And I'm speaking from a personal point of view, that I don't know about everyone else's degrees or education when they were younger or anything like that, but mine definitely didn't go into ethics. You know, it was never a topic, it was never discussed, it was never challenged. It was always about creating something beautiful, creating something that, you know, would be able to, I did an arts degree, so kind of a little bit different, but it kind of never went into the ramifications of what I was doing on the audience that I was delivering it to. So, you know, you're all here this evening, obviously, because you care about this, so that's fantastic. But for me, this does come up quite a lot. Trap number 3, so a lack of design leadership or aligned goals. So going back to the sense of, you know, there's obviously a lot that we're trying to solve all the time. If you're not together as a group and you work collaboratively, it's not really one of those things that's quite possible to tackle. You know, you've got to kind of either have someone in a design leadership goal that cares passionately about it and is always the advocate and kind of at the forefront of what you're trying to do, or as a team, in a smaller group, in a project team, you just need to agree, like, where are your boundaries? You know, is there grey area? Is there stuff that, you know, you're willing to do? Is there stuff that you're not willing to do? And once that's agreed, it's surprising how smooth and easy it is from that. And then there's trap number 4 is the lure of dark design. And I'm going to sound a little bit evil here, and that's not intentional, but there is a certain lure towards using techniques you know work. So, you know, it can be quite easy if you're, you know, running through something and you're trying to deliver work, and you're like, well, obviously I would do this because it's going to be effective and the client's going to be happy. It's not even a cognitive decision. It's just something that you do by accident because it just makes sense. So these are a couple of phrases I thought I'm probably familiar to some of you in the room, but give you kind of a bit of a grey area. So on one hand, you've got creating a path of least resistance to lead the user. I'm sure all of us have done that at some point. Adding social proof to position something more favourably than it actually is. I have definitely done that one. A false culture of status. So choosing the right things to be positioned in the right ways with the right quotes and the right influencers, for instance. Creating something visually beautiful to make people spend more time. This is like one of those accidental consequences, you know, because you just like creating something that's quite beautiful, engaging, and, you know, the chance of people to be on your site for longer than necessary is obviously a benefit. And then emotional triggers to make your audience desire. There's a lot of stuff in that one to make another talk. So on top of that, I just wanted to touch on this attention economy very quickly, because I think that there's a lot of culpability that's currently put on us as designers. But at the same time, I don't know about you guys, but we're all designing, as Phil was saying, in this point where we're constantly getting barraged with messages all the time. And from what I do, it's about how do you cut through all that noise. You know, so it's quite a scary fact that the German Lifeguard Association said that parents and grandparents now are so much on their mobile phones. 300 children died last year due to drowning for unintended consequences because the parents were distracted. So there's like a physical consequence, and then there's also the fact that, you know, we can be actually touching our device over 1,000 times a day, which is just weird, and also not a euphemism. So, you know, this fantastic quote by Kevin Kelly, a great author, he said, the only factor becoming scarce in a world of abundance is human attention. And that's so true. And I think really, from my point of view, designers can sometimes be in a bit of a pressure cooker. You know, we're constantly driven to do stuff, and we're obviously going to use every possible lever that we have at our disposal to be able to achieve what's required. That's just a natural setting. And yet, we're also asking people to suddenly take a moment and pause and think. But I just want to land on the idea that this is kind of a logical choice. You know, we're going to use those things in our arsenal. So for me, ethics is very much a spectrum. So it's quite easy to slide from the left to the right, but ultimately, you know, you want to start at a position where you're designing to support users' desired behavior, you know, which I think is the ingredient there. You want to then move into obviously aligning the user's needs and business needs through design. Okay, that still works. But then you start moving into design that favors business needs over those of the user, probably where some of us spend a lot of our time debating. And then at the end you've got deceptive design that's there to trick the audience. You know, so this is a spectrum. It's not so easy saying, oh yeah, I'm ethical or not ethical, or, you know, you can kind of slide from one side to the other exceptionally easily. So I think from my point of view, I just wanted to land, we're essentially at this interesting inflection point in our life cycle as designers of all different shapes and sizes. And from my point of view, I think there's sometimes so much of a focus on audience. You know, we're so told to look at our target audience and who they are as individuals. What's their behavior? What do they like? How would the brand resonate with them, and so on. And sometimes it's easy to consider our audience as individuals. And I think they're individuals in kind of bubbles. And from my point of view, I think you need to start thinking wider. So if you think about users as individuals, think about if they use your service, if they use your product, if they use anything associated with the brand you're working on, how does that affect their family? Like, how would that behavior affect their family? How would it affect the local community, for instance, if it's something like a service? What would that ripple effect be into society? What would it have on the environment? And sometimes you don't have a lot of time to do this, but I think it's trying to push your mindset just naturally that one step wider and stop focusing about just the individual. And there's things to look into, which the government released a really interesting strategic objectives report for 2035, which sounded way more dense when I just said that. But it's quite interesting to have a nosy through. And some of the key features I think to kind of be aware of from all design is really, there's a sense in the world of increasing human empowerment, which I think is fascinating. So the first part of it is essentially everyone that's being lifted up from poverty around the world is increasing their engagement and access to education and technology. And that kind of heads us right back into the realm of them suddenly being exposed to all of those things Phil had mentioned with his ads and emails and banners and so on. You know, so we're dealing with an audience that's not necessarily digitally mature, but now is suddenly in a world with a lot of other people that kind of know what to look out for. Then there's individualism and personal empowerment, so that people associating their identity and starting to come together globally. That's the interactions in global communities. You've got digitization, changing family structures. You've got people associating with stuff from all around the world. It's just a sense of empowerment that people are exhibiting in certain political scenarios and more, just to kind of take into account. The other is, we all know, this accelerating technological advancement. So that means things as small as the increase in computing power, and that's the increase in access to technology. It's cheaper, again, it's more available. Types of technology. There's an interplay though. The interplay, the layering of technology and the integrations together are entering a sphere that I'm not sure many of us necessarily know exactly how to, like I was saying, uncharted waters, how to navigate our way through every single time. Because all of these interplays of technology are moving further and further into everyone's daily lives. And then the last one in there is really the increase in society's capacity to actually absorb technology. It can sometimes be faster than some of the things we're actually designing. So that by the time we design something and we release it, it's moved on. Which is quite an interesting conundrum. I'm going to just get really stressed at the end of this. And lastly is the expanded unregulated information space. I promise I didn't put this in because I work at PwC. But it is something that's quite interesting because it keeps popping up. But basically, it's just the sheer speed of stuff coming out, regulation cannot keep up with. So we're in this unusual scenario where things are being invented, people are trying to put regulation in to actually help when it comes to ethics and protect people, when it comes to privacy, for instance.
So the Civil Aviation Authority is working on a huge program at the moment to help license drones for privacy, to be able to protect citizens. But by the time they come up with that, there's probably going to be a different type of drone, a different type of drone usage, a different, so that sort of speed is particularly difficult to keep up with. And so for me, I was saying, I love this quote. I don't know if you ever read any of her work, but Kat, who works at IBM, she's like, at the end of the day, no one's neutral, and doing nothing is also not neutral. So you've got to make a decision. You have to take a stand for this. And so for me, there's just a couple of tips I'd give you guys to say, for every user task, try and introduce an ethical KPI. So by that I mean, try to introduce a KPI around trust or relationships or brand. Some of the softer ones, but the ones that you can actually measure through user interviews, for instance, and testing and more. If you just do user tasks and goal tasks, then you'll always end up kind of in that bottom of the barrel, super efficient approach. Principles like autonomy, transparency, and safety are really good guides. So by that I mean autonomy of the user. So making sure, as Phil was saying, make sure you have control, and you give the user control and autonomy to decide what they would like to do. Transparency, does what it says on the tin, is making sure everything's transparent and you're very honest with the person. And then safety actually has multiple facets, because it's safety both from well-being and identity and control and task orientation. It's a feeling of comfort, essentially. Consider any positive need and then the unintended negative collateral. So if you target something to a particular user group, could that be misconstrued as discrimination against another user group, for instance? So kind of just look at both sides of that to make sure you answer it. Apply a white hat hacker policy. So try and find your weak spots. So try and find the vulnerabilities. Try and figure out with your service what asshole's going to come in and basically ruin your idea. Go through all of those different things and start to think about the solutions. Add a forecast stage into design thinking. So after your ideation phase for design, and you can do it before you go into any form of testing, start doing forecasting. So again, look at your idea and consider what it'd be like in the future. What is it going to be like for people to use? So 2 years from now, 1 year from now, even if you want to do near term. It's quite an interesting way to be able to throw it into the future and consider greater consequences. Humanizing your audience is always incredibly helpful. Design leadership, like I said. And diverse perspectives. So it seems it's not rocket science. If you have a very diverse team, you're going to have a lot of diverse perspectives and experiences, and each one of those is going to add a huge amount of value into what you do. So every human being on this planet is obligated to do our best to leave this planet in better shape. So designers don't get to opt out. I think, from my point of view, I realise it's only been the last few years, I realise it's generally very much on me. It's my decision. It's what I wanted to focus on. And essentially, we have the power to design for the future we all want. So I guess my only question to you guys is, what's your legacy going to be? If you want to keep chatting or arguing or anything afterwards, then I'm more than open to having a beer. And then I've got my social on there if you want to keep chatting. And then we are hiring. So we're hiring experienced designers, visual designers, and service designers as we grow. So if you want to have a chat about that, come and talk to me too.